Chapter 1, The Red Flag. The scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood usually signaled a successful closing for Andrew Martin. Tonight, it smelled like a trap. The private lounge of the Gilded Leaf was a relic of old-world opulence, heavy velvet curtains, dim amber lighting, and the kind of silence that suggested the walls were built to keep secrets. Across the mahogany table sat the man known only as Spade. At 38, Spade possessed a refined lethality, his sharp features framed by a tailored charcoal suit that couldn't quite hide the coiled tension of a predator. "It's a simple logistical hurdle, Andrew," Spade said, his voice a smooth, low baritone. He gestured with a silver-clipped cigar. "My associates have high-end, artisanal goods coming in from the Adriatic. Your docks are the most efficient in the tri-state area. We want to skip the red tape. A few containers that don't need to be logged in the manifest. In exchange, Martin Shipping and Logistics sees a 30% increase in annual revenue overnight." Andrew leaned back, his own expression a mask of practiced corporate indifference. Underneath the silk of his dress shirt, his shoulders were tight. He hadn't spent 6 years in military intelligence just to lose his nose for a rot job. 30% is a desperate number, Spade, Andrew replied calmly. And artisanal goods is a vague term for something that usually requires a hazmat suit or a ballistics report. My company is built on transparency. If it isn't on the manifest, it doesn't touch my cranes. Spade's smile didn't reach his eyes. They remained flat, like two polished stones. Transparency is a luxury for those who don't have enemies. You've had a very peaceful run, Andrew. It would be a shame for the docks to become volatile. Is that a threat? Andrew asked, his voice dropping an octave. It's a market forecast, Spade countered. He stood up, the movement fluid and ominous. Think about it. I'll give you 48 hours to realize that a no to me is a very expensive mistake. The walk back to his car felt longer than usual. The city air was biting, and for the first time in years, Andrew found himself checking the reflection in the shop windows behind him. The next morning, his office at Martin Shipping was humming with its usual frantic energy, but his executive secretary, Sarah, was waiting by his desk with a look that suggested she'd already heard the news through the grapevine, or perhaps she just knew Andrew too well. "He threatened you," she stated, skipping the morning pleasantries. "He offered a bad deal." "I declined," Andrew said, hanging his coat. "The rest was just theater." "Spade doesn't do theater. He does funerals," Sarah snapped, dropping a thick, matte black folder onto his desk. "I've already vetted them. J Security. They're the elite of the elite. The founder is a man named Jaxton Sycamore. Young, but he's got a 100% success rate with high-profile clients under active threat." Andrew sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Sarah, I was a captain. I can hold my own." "You were a captain in logistics and intelligence, Andrew. You weren't a one-man army," she countered, her eyes softening but remaining firm. "You're a CEO now. You're a target. If you won't hire him for your own sake, hire him so I don't have to spend my mornings wondering if I'm going to be the one to find your body." Andrew looked at the folder. The embossed logo of a stylized J caught the light. He thought of the coldness in Spade's eyes and the heavy silence of the lounge. "Fine," Andrew muttered, pulling the folder toward him. "Set up a meeting. But if he shows up with a bunch of meatheads in sunglasses, he's out." "Trust me," Sarah said, heading for the door with a ghost of a smirk. "Mr. Sycamore is anything but a meathead." Andrew opened the file. A headshot fell out. A man with sharp, observant eyes and a jawline that looked carved from granite stared back at him. Jaxton Sycamore. He looked younger than 30, yet he possessed a gaze that seemed to see right through the paper. Andrew felt a strange, inexplicable prickle at the base of his neck. For the first time since the meeting with Spade, it wasn't a feeling of dread. It was the feeling that his life was about to change in ways that had nothing to do with shipping containers. Chapter 2, The Shadow Arrives. The glass-walled corner office of Martin Shipping usually felt like a sanctuary of order. Today, it felt like a fishbowl. Andrew was attempting to focus on a quarterly logistics report, but his gaze kept drifting to the man currently crouching by his floor-to-ceiling windows. Jaxton Sycamore had arrived 10 minutes early, bypassed the pleasantries with Sarah, and immediately began a technical sweep that made Andrew's own military background feel like a distant, dusty memory. Jaxton was younger than Andrew, 29, according to the file, but he moved with a grounded, predatory grace. He wore a charcoal suit that was clearly custom-tailored to accommodate the holster hidden beneath his ribs without ruining the silhouette. "The glass is reinforced, but the seals are standard," Jaxton remarked, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the quiet office. He stood up, brushing invisible dust from his slacks. "I'll want those replaced with high-tension gaskets by Monday. And the HVAC vents in the hallway need motion sensors." Andrew leaned back, crossing his arms. "I thought you were here to be a bodyguard, Mr. Sycamore, not an interior decorator." Jaxton turned. Up close, his eyes weren't just observant, they were analytical, stripping Andrew down to his base components. "A bodyguard is a failure, Mr. Martin. If I have to use my body to shield yours, it means I didn't control the environment well enough. I prefer to be a specialist in prevention." "I like the confidence," Andrew admitted, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "But I'm not a difficult client. I don't go to galas, I don't have a messy social life, and I live for my spreadsheets. My secretary thinks I'm a target, I think I'm just a guy who said no to a bad businessman." "Spade isn't a businessman. He's a parasite," Jaxton corrected him. He stepped closer, entering Andrew's personal space with a deliberate lack of hesitation. He smelled of rain and something metallic, gun oil, perhaps. "He doesn't just want your ships. He wants to break your reputation for refusing him. People like that don't go away because you're not difficult. They go away when the cost of touching you becomes too high to pay." Jaxton walked to the mahogany desk and placed a small, black device near the phone. "This is an encrypted comms link. If we're separated, you press the center. Don't wait for a reason. If you feel a chill, you press it." "Understood," Andrew said, his voice softer now. He found himself fascinated by the way Jaxton's hands moved, efficient, steady, and strangely elegant. The first watch began that evening. Andrew stayed late, as he always did, the amber glow of the city skyline bleeding through the windows. Jaxton didn't sit in the plush guest chairs. He stood in the shadows near the door, a silent sentinel who seemed perfectly comfortable with the silence. Around 10 p.m., Andrew rubbed his eyes, the numbers on his screen beginning to blur. He heard the faint rustle of fabric and looked up to see Jaxton standing by the small kitchenette in the corner of the office. "You haven't eaten since the turkey sandwich at noon," Jaxton noted, pouring a glass of water and setting it on Andrew's desk. "And your breathing has slowed. You're hitting the wall." Andrew blinked, surprised. "You're tracking my breathing?" "It's part of the job," Jaxton replied, his expression unreadable. "I need to know your baseline so I can recognize your panic." "I don't panic," Andrew said, though he took the water. "Everyone panics, Andrew. Some people just do it quietly." Jaxton's gaze lingered on him a second too long, a beat of silence that wasn't professional, wasn't tactical. It was curious. "Pack up. I'm taking you home." As they walked to the elevator, Jaxton stayed half a step behind and to the left, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrored surfaces. For the first time in his life, Andrew felt the strange sensation of being seen, not as a CEO, not as a former officer, but as something precious that needed to be kept whole. In the quiet of the descending elevator, Andrew watched Jaxton's reflection. The younger man was watching the floor numbers, his jaw set in a hard line. Andrew realized then that having Jaxton Sycamore around wasn't going to make his life easier. It was going to make it much more complicated. Chapter 3, Cracks in the Armor. The transition from client to person happened somewhere on the I-95, nestled in the leather-scented interior of Andrew's armored SUV. For the first week, the silence between them had been tactical, a vacuum designed for listening to the world outside the reinforced windows. But by the second week, the silence had begun to itch. Jaxton was always there, a permanent shadow in the periphery, his presence as constant as the hum of the engine. "You don't drive like a civilian," Andrew remarked, watching Jaxton's hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, 10-2, but his grip was light, ready to wrench the wheel into an evasive maneuver at a moment's notice. "Army?" Jaxton didn't take his eyes off the rearview mirror. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 tours. U. Logistics and intelligence. Mostly coordinating supply lines in high-threat zones. "I spent more time staring at topographical maps than I did at people," Andrew said, leaning his head back against the headrest. "It's why I'm good at shipping. The ocean is just a bigger map with fewer places to hide." Jaxton's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a softening of the granite. "Intelligence, huh? So you're the reason my unit actually got their cold-weather gear before the snow hit. If you were in the Hindu Kush in 15, then yes." "That was me," Andrew chuckled. The tension in the car shifted. It was a subtle recalibration, like a radio frequency finally snapping into clarity. They spent the next hour trading sand and salt stories, the absurd bureaucracy of the military, the taste of lukewarm memories, and the jarring, quiet thrum of returning to a world that moved too fast and cared too little about the things they had seen. "I missed the structure," Jaxton admitted as they pulled into the subterranean parking garage of Andrew's penthouse. He killed the engine but didn't move to open the door. The dim overhead lights cast long, sharp shadows across his face. "In the service, you always knew where your threat was. In the private sector, the threats were silk ties and shake your hand." "Like Spade," Andrew said quietly. "Like Spade," Jaxton agreed. He turned his head then, his gaze dropping from Andrew's eyes to the pulse point in his neck. "You're tired, Andrew. Your heart rate is elevated, but your movements are sluggish. You're pushing yourself because you think if you stop working, the threat becomes real." Andrew felt a sudden, sharp heat in his chest. It wasn't just the observation, it was the way Jaxton said his name. It wasn't a formal address anymore. It was a recognition. "I hired you to watch the door, Jax. Not my vitals." "I watch everything," Jaxton replied, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that made the small hairs on Andrew's arm stand up. "I know how you take your coffee, black, 2 sugars, always cold by the time you finish it. I know you check the locks on your balcony 3 times before you lie down, even though I've already swept the perimeter. And I know you haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since we met." Andrew opened his mouth to argue, to re-establish the boundary, but the words died in his throat. Jaxton was looking at him with a fierce, possessive intensity that had nothing to do with a paycheck. It was the look of a man who had claimed a piece of territory and would burn the world down to keep it pristine. "Go upstairs," Jaxton said, his voice returning to a professional clip, though the heat remained in his eyes. "I'll be right behind you." That night, Andrew didn't check the balcony locks. He stood by the window and watched the reflection of the door, where Jaxton sat in the living room, a silent silhouette against the city lights. He fell asleep to the rhythmic, distant sound of Jaxton's footsteps in the hallway, a steady, predatory lullaby that promised, for the first time in years, that he was truly safe. Chapter 4, The Inspection Incident. The salt air at the port of New Jersey was biting, a cold Atlantic wind whipping through the towering stacks of multicolored shipping containers. It was a landscape of steel giants, the kind of place Andrew Martin felt most at home, and the kind of place Jaxton Sycamore hated most for security. "Too many blind spots," Jaxton muttered, his earpiece glinting in the pale morning sun. He stayed a half step behind Andrew, his hand never straying more than an inch from the hem of his jacket. "Between the cranes and the stacks, there are 1,000 angles I can't clear simultaneously. It's a routine inspection, Jax, Andrew said, though he didn't dismiss the concern. He tucked his tablet under his arm, nodding to a foreman in the distance. We're upgrading the automated tracking on Pier 17. I need to see the physical layout before the technicians arrive. They moved deep into the labyrinth of the yard. The hum of distant machinery provided a mechanical white noise that should have been soothing, but Jaxton's shoulders were pulled tight. His intuition wasn't just a skill, it was a physical weight in his chest. Stop, Jaxton commanded, his voice a sharp blade. Andrew froze instantly. His military training didn't ask questions, it obeyed the tone of a man who smelled blood before it was spilled. From the shadow of a rusted red container to their left, a figure emerged, then another from the right. They weren't dockworkers. They wore tactical gear stripped of insignia, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas. Behind me. Jaxton roared. The first assassin lunged with a suppressed pistol, but Jaxton was a blur of controlled violence. He closed the distance in 2 strides, redirecting the shooter's arm with a bone-cracking parry. A muffled thwip echoed as a round buried itself in the asphalt. Andrew didn't stay idle. As a third man swung a heavy iron pipe toward Jaxton's blind side, Andrew stepped in, catching the man's wrist and using his momentum to drive a knee into his solar plexus. It was a clean, efficient takedown, but the numbers were shifting. Move to the gap. Jaxton shouted, shoving Andrew toward a narrow space between 2 containers. As they retreated, a fourth attacker, hidden atop a crate, dropped down with a serrated combat knife. Jaxton didn't have time to draw his sidearm. He threw himself into the path of the blade, his primary focus not on the threat, but on the man he was sworn to protect. The knife sank into the meat of Jaxton's shoulder with a sickening, wet thud. Jaxton didn't scream. He let out a low, guttural growl, seizing the attacker's throat with his good arm and slamming him into the steel wall of the container with enough force to knock him unconscious. Jax. Andrew's voice cracked, his professional composure shattering. I'm fine, Jaxton gasped, though his face had gone gray. Blood began to bloom across the shoulder of his charcoal suit, turning the fabric a dark, glistening crimson. He drew his weapon with his left hand, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a terrifying, cold fury. Get to the car. Now. Andrew grabbed Jaxton by his tactical vest, steadying him as they retreated. The bodyguard was flagging, his breathing coming in ragged, painful hitches, but his gaze remained locked on the horizon, shielding Andrew with his own staggering frame. They reached the SUV, Andrew shoving Jaxton into the passenger seat and diving behind the wheel. As he floored the accelerator, peeling away from the shipyard, he reached over, pressing his palm firmly against the wound in Jaxton's shoulder to stem the flow. You idiot, Andrew hissed, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never had in the Middle East. You took that from me. Jaxton leaned his head back, his eyes fluttering as he looked at Andrew. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a raw, aching devotion that bypassed every line of their contract. That's the job, Andrew, Jaxton whispered, his blood staining Andrew's expensive watch and silk cuff. No, Andrew replied, his voice trembling with a realization that terrified him. That wasn't the job. That was you. Chapter 5, Hospital Stakes. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the private wing at St. Jude's Hospital felt like a pressurized chamber. Andrew stood by the window, his silk shirt ruined, the cuffs stiff with Jaxton's drying blood. He refused the nurse's offer of a fresh tunic, as if shedding the stained clothes would mean abandoning the reality of what had just happened. On the bed, Jaxton looked smaller than Andrew had ever seen him. The heavy sedation for the shoulder debridement had smoothed the hard edges of his face, leaving him looking younger, stripped of his lethal shell. You need to leave, Andrew, Sarah whispered from the doorway. She had arrived 20 minutes prior with a fresh security detail from J Security's secondary tier. Spade knows where you are. This wing is a fishbowl. I'm not leaving, Andrew said, his voice flat and immovable. He's in that bed because of me. If Spade wants him, he has to come through me. Sarah sighed, recognizing the stubborn glint of a commanding officer in Andrew's eyes. She stepped out to coordinate with the new guards, leaving the two of them in a heavy, medicinal silence. A low groan came from the bed. Jaxton's head lolled to the side, his eyes fluttering open, glazed with morphine but searching. Andrew, his voice was a sandpaper rasp. Andrew was at his side in a heartbeat, taking Jaxton's uninjured hand. "I'm here, Jax. The surgery went well. You're lucky the blade missed the artery." Jaxton's grip on Andrew's hand was surprisingly tight, his knuckles white. "The shipyard, did they get you?" I lost the rhythm." "You didn't lose anything." "I'm fine." "You saved me," Andrew murmured, leaning closer. Jaxton's eyes focused then, a raw, feverish clarity breaking through the drugs. "I hate it," he whispered, his thumb tracing the underside of Andrew's wrist, right over the pulse. "Hate seeing you in the line of fire." It's not the contract anymore, Andrew. If you stop breathing, the world just stops. I can't let the world stop." The confession hung in the air, heavier than any tactical report. Andrew felt a lump form in his throat, a fierce, protective ache that mirrored Jaxton's own. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sudden, sharp crack of a silenced pistol echoing from the hallway cut the moment short. The red emergency light above the door began to pulse. "Contact," Jaxton hissed, the morphine haze vanishing as his reptilian brain took over. He tried to sit up, his face contorting in agony as his shoulder protested. "Stay down," Andrew commanded, drawing the backup sidearm Jaxton had insisted he carry in his waistband. He kicked the bedside table over to create a barricade and killed the lights. "They're in the hall. Sarah's team is engaged." The shadows in the room lengthened as the power to the wing was cut, plunged into the eerie red glow of the backup generators. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate, approached the door. "Jax, can you hold a weapon?" Andrew asked, his voice steady as he took a low-light firing position near the foot of the bed. "Give me the .45, Jaxton rasped, reaching out with his left hand. "If they want this room, they're going to have to pay for it in liters." They sat in the crimson dark, two men who had spent their lives protecting others, now reduced to protecting each other. The door handle turned slowly. Chapter 6, The Last Stand. The heavy oak door of the recovery suite didn't just open, it exploded inward as a flashbang canister skittered across the linoleum. "Eyes!" Jaxton barked, his voice rasping but authoritative. Andrew squeezed his eyes shut a split second before the white light detonated, the roar muffled by the heavy hospital bedding he'd piled against the door. The room plunged back into that rhythmic, hellish emergency red. The first silhouette through the door didn't even see Andrew. The assassin was focused on the bed, his submachine gun leveled at the shape of the pillows. Andrew didn't hesitate. From his low-profile position behind the overturned mahogany table, he fired 2 shots. The suppressed thud-thud was swallowed by the chaos, and the man crumpled. "Left flank, Andrew." "Low." Jaxton's voice came from the bed, sharp and cold. Despite the morphine and the agonizing tear in his shoulder, Jaxton was leaning against the headboard, his left hand steady as a rock as he braced his pistol against his bent knee. He fired a single shot, the bullet catching a second attacker through the gap in the door hinges before the man could even round the corner. It was a terrifying, beautiful display of synchronicity. They weren't just a bodyguard and a client anymore, they were a fire team. Andrew provided the heavy cover, moving with a predatory efficiency he hadn't used since his days in the desert, while Jaxton, even wounded, acted as the tactical brain, calling out angles and shadows with a chillingly calm cadence. "They're bottlenecking in the corridor," Jaxton hissed, his breath hitching as he shifted his weight. "They know we've got the high ground in here. They're going to try to smoke us out." "Let them try," Andrew muttered. He swapped magazines, the metallic click loud in the sudden silence of the room. He looked back at Jaxton. The younger man's face was slick with sweat, his hospital gown soaked in fresh blood from his reopened stitches, but his eyes, they were glowing with a fierce, possessive fire. "Jax, you're bleeding out," Andrew whispered, a spike of panic hitting his chest. "I'm staying awake until you're safe, Andrew." "That's the only metric that matters," Jaxton replied. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers grazing Andrew's sleeve. "Go. The service elevator is 20 feet to the right of the door. If I hold the line here." "Shut up," Andrew snapped, the command sharp enough to make Jaxton blink. "We leave together, or we die in this room. There is no middle ground." Andrew didn't wait for an argument. He grabbed a canister of fire suppressant from the wall near the bed. He waited for the telltale shadow of a third attacker, then he hurled the heavy red bottle into the hallway and fired a single shot into its base. The hallway vanished in a blinding cloud of white powder and chemical fog. "Now." Andrew lunged for the bed, hooking his arm under Jaxton's good shoulder. They moved as one, a staggering, blood-stained unit. Andrew bore most of Jaxton's weight, his own body acting as a human shield as they broke for the door. Two more hitmen emerged from the fog, coughing and blinded. Andrew neutralized them with the butt of his weapon, his movements fueled by a protective rage he didn't know he possessed. They reached the service elevator just as Sarah's reinforcements crested the stairs. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a late but welcome chorus. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in the quiet, mirrored box, Andrew finally let Jaxton slide to the floor. He collapsed beside him, pressing his forehead against Jaxton's. "You're a terrible patient," Andrew breathed, his hand shaking as he checked Jaxton's pulse. Jaxton leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed but a ghost of a smirk on his lips. "And you're a very expensive liability, Mr. Martin." "The contract is over, Jax," Andrew whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "From here on out, it's personal." Chapter 7, The Contract Ends. The aftermath of the hospital siege was a blur of blue lights, federal statements, and a relentless, hollow ache in Andrew's chest. With the evidence Jaxton had secured and the failed assassination attempt at the hospital, the FBI moved with uncharacteristic speed. Spade, whose real name was revealed to be a disgraced former diplomat named Elias Thorne, was apprehended at a private airfield. The threat that had loomed over Andrew for months was snuffed out in a single afternoon of raids and handcuffs. But as the external chaos died down, the silence inside Andrew's penthouse became deafening. 3 weeks had passed. The bandages on Jaxton's shoulder had been replaced by a jagged, angry scar that he wore like a badge of office. He was back in his charcoal suit, his posture as impeccable as ever, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer charged with the adrenaline of the hunt, it was heavy with the finality of a deadline. Andrew sat at his mahogany desk, the same one Jaxton had swept for bugs on their first day. He wasn't looking at spreadsheets. He was looking at the final invoice from J Security. "The perimeter is secure, Andrew," Jaxton said, standing by the door. He didn't come closer. He remained in that bodyguard space, close enough to intervene, far enough to be a stranger. "My team has finished the final sweep of the docks. Spade's assets are frozen. You're no longer on the hit list." Andrew looked up, his heart sinking. "I see. So, this is the part where you tell me your job is done." Jaxton's jaw tightened. He adjusted his cufflink, a nervous tick Andrew had only seen once before. The contract was for protection against a specific threat. That threat is neutralized. My company has 3 other high-risk clients waiting for a lead detail. I'm scheduled to fly to Chicago tomorrow. The thought of Jaxton in another city, guarding another person, memorizing someone else's breathing patterns, felt like a physical blow to Andrew's solar plexus. "I don't want you to go," Andrew said. It wasn't a CEO's command, it was a plea. Jaxton finally crossed the room, his footsteps silent on the rug. He stopped at the edge of the desk, his gaze dropping to the ruined silk cuff Andrew still kept in his drawer, the one stained with Jaxton's blood. I'm a bodyguard, Andrew, Jaxton said softly, his voice cracking. I'm meant to be the shadow, not the person standing in the light with you. If I stay, I don't know how to be just a professional anymore. Every time you leave the room, my heart rate spikes. Every time your phone rings, I'm ready to draw. I've lost my distance. I'm compromised. Then be compromised, Andrew countered, standing up. He moved around the desk until he was inches from Jaxton. I don't want a shadow. I want you. Jaxton looked at him, his eyes swimming with a mixture of duty and desire. I have a team, Andrew. Men and women who depend on me for their livelihoods. I can't just walk away from J Security to play house. I know, Andrew said, a slow, calculated smile spreading across his face, the look of a CEO who had just found the perfect loophole. Which is why I'm not asking you to walk away from them. I have a different proposal. One that's strictly business, mostly. Jaxton blinked, his tactical brain momentarily short-circuiting. What kind of proposal? Andrew picked up a new folder, blue this time, the color of Martin shipping. Let's talk about the security of my docks. And let's talk about why I need a permanent partner who knows how to handle a crisis. Chapter 8, The Logistics of Love. The boardroom of Martin Shipping and Logistics was usually a place of cold calculations and shipping manifests. Today, it felt like the stage for the most expensive gamble of Andrew's life. Jaxton stood across from him, his brow furrowed as he looked over the thick stack of papers Andrew had slid across the table. His team, the core members of J Security, stood in the hallway, their presence a silent, disciplined weight. You want to bring my entire firm in-house? Jaxton asked, his voice skeptical. Andrew, I'm a boutique agency. We do high-risk extraction and close protection. You're talking about site security, freight oversight, and internal investigations. I'm talking about a complete overhaul, Andrew corrected, leaning against the edge of the table. I realized something during that hospital siege. My company is efficient, but it's vulnerable. I don't just want guards at the gate. I want an elite intelligence and security wing that handles the integrity of every shipment that leaves my docks. I want J Security to be the Iron Curtain of Martin Shipping. Jaxton flipped to the final page, his eyes widening. The compensation package. Andrew, this is nearly triple our annual revenue. My men would have full benefits, pension plans, and hazard pay that exceeds private contracting rates. It's a fair price for the best, Andrew said, his voice dropping into a softer, more intimate register. He stepped around the table, closing the distance until the air between them hummed with the familiar heat of the last few months. And it means you don't have to fly to Chicago. It means your team stays together, right here. Overseeing my shipments, my docks, and me. Jaxton looked at the contract, then back at Andrew. The elite bodyguard was gone, replaced by a man who was clearly struggling with the sheer scale of the devotion being offered. You're buying my company just to keep me in the city? I'm investing in a future where I don't have to wonder which continent you're on, Andrew countered. I'm a logistics man, Jax. I've calculated the risks. Life without you is a deficit I'm not willing to accept. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across Jaxton's face, the first one Andrew had seen that didn't have a tactical edge to it. You're incredibly persistent. I'm a CEO, Andrew shrugged. I'm used to getting what I want. Jaxton picked up the pen, his hand steady as he signed his name in a sharp, decisive script. Then consider J Security yours, Mr. Martin. The move into the new house happened 2 weeks later. It wasn't the penthouse, that place held too many memories of red emergency lights and the scent of gunpowder. Instead, they chose a sprawling, modern estate overlooking the harbor, a place with high walls, state-of-the-art sensors, and enough space for a life that didn't involve hiding. It was late evening, the sun dipping below the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Andrew stood on the balcony, watching the distant lights of the cranes at the docks. A pair of strong arms wrapped around his waist from behind. Jaxton tucked his chin into the crook of Andrew's neck, the scarred tissue of his shoulder pressing against Andrew's back. He wasn't wearing a suit. In a simple black t-shirt, he looked relaxed, his breathing deep and synchronized with the rhythm of the waves below. "Perimeter is clear," Jaxton whispered against his skin. Andrew turned in his arms, looping his hands around Jaxton's neck. "You're off the clock, Jax. My team is at the gate. You're supposed to be resting." "I am resting," Jaxton murmured, his eyes fixed on Andrew with a fierce, quiet adoration. "For the first time in 10 years, I'm not looking for the exit. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." There were no more contracts between them, no more daily rates or professional boundaries. There was only the steady beat of two hearts that had found their rhythm in the middle of a war. As Andrew leaned in to kiss him, he realized that the bodyguard hadn't just protected his life, he had given him a reason to live it. The watch was over, and the devotion had only just begun.